Hi everybody. Today we are going to present our paper entitled See How Arabic, Chinese and English Native Speakers read Stories, Schema Analysis. The relationship between language and culture has been a major issue of concerns for psychologists, anthropologists and philosophers for a long time. Kant claimed that new information, new concepts, and new ideas can have meaning only when they can be related to something already known by the reader or the individual. Cultural schema refers to a discipline of cognitive anthropology that is derived from social structure. This term is used interchangeably with cultural models that include schematic representations of general concepts shared among individuals of the same culture. Many scholars like these introduce that cultural schema principles and readers' cultural orientation in relation to interpretation while reading the cultural texts. And different researchers like these attempt to understand the relationship between culture and language and reading practices and reading, and the role of cultural schema and interpretation. However, none of these studies emphasize the role of using English to communicate culturally familiar and unfamiliar text and how this contradicts readers' existing cultural schema, particularly within a context where three different cultures were addressed, like Arabic, Chinese, and English. Hence, in this study, an understanding of the role of cultural schema in nurturing reading interpretation was considered. English as a medium of interpretation could influence the reader's interpretation and communication of their ideas. The purpose of this study is to understand the role of cultural schema in nurturing the reading interpretation was considered, particularly when using English as a medium of interpretation. Also capturing the reader's views toward their reading of different cultural-based narrative texts and how English as a medium of interpretation could influence their interpretation and communication of their ideas. This study was guided by one main research question: how do college students from different cultures interpret culture-based narrative texts using English as a medium of interpretation? And two sub-questions: how do native Arabic, Chinese, and English speakers respond to cultural-based narrative texts using English as a medium of interpretation? And the second one is, how do Arabic, Chinese, and English native speakers view their reading of different culture-based narrative texts?
The methodology. This study followed a qualitative research approach. We had written document analysis and interviews. Our participants were 6 college students, 2 Arabic, 2 Chinese, and 2 British. The participants were conveniently and purposefully selected based on their availability and willingness to participate, which is one of the main features of the convenience sampling. The instruments in this, we had 3 culturally relevant stories, one in Arabic, Chinese, and English. Each participant read 2 passages, answered the questions after the passage, and then we analyzed their answers. The analytical techniques were adapted from Coffee. We used it to analyze the document, including the process of production, linguistic features, and the contained content. As you can see here, students had to answer 5 tasks after reading reading each story. First, they had to to understand the main idea of the story through creating their own title from their own words. Then they have to tell the whole story events. The third task was to elaborate the intended meanings. The fourth one was extracting the moral values, and the last one was to state their opinion about the story they read. Here is the framework that we followed for this study. The analysis followed cultural schema analysis, where we had the document analysis. We looked at the cultural metaphor interpretation patterns. The criteria for each text, we looked at reading time, just recall, elaboration, and distortion. The analysis took 4 phases. The first one was training, second was rating, the third was discussion, and the last one was decision. For the interview analysis, we looked at the students' attitude towards cultural schema. From their interviews, we looked at the common themes, and we had 4 themes. The first one was enhancing reading and interpretation through culturally relevant text. The second one was distorted interpretation of unfamiliar cultural text. The third one was stimulation of cultural narrative text. The last one was reciprocal interweaving between cultural schema and linguistic competence. We look at consistency in among both analysis to reach our conceptual schema interpretation of reading cultural relevant text. Data analysis procedure were adapted from Stephen, Jack, Dave, and Anderson. For the procedure was, we measured 4 main criteria. The first one was the amount of time students spent to read. Then the just recall, which is the amount of recall of text elements. Then we measure the number of readers' modification of the text through elaboration and distortion. You can see here that this is how we actually analyzed, and a sample of our analysis.
Moving to the major findings, the first research questions: how do native Arab, Chinese, and English speakers respond to cultural-based narrative text using English as a medium for interpretation? Results in the first table indicate a noticeable difference between the participants, the English native speakers participants, processing of a familiar text, okay, which is the English story, and the processing of the unfamiliar narrative text, which is the Chinese story. So they spend less time in processing the English text than the Chinese one, although both are presented in English language, with higher frequency in just recall and elaboration when they process the English stories than the Chinese one. Although Mary also in her elaboration in the Chinese story was a little bit higher than the English one, this relates to her writing volume, in which she wrote more in Chinese in a story in order to elaborate more for more understanding. With regard to the distortion, distortion was found to be significantly higher in Chinese narratives compared to the English narrative text. In terms of the Chinese native speakers, they needed almost double the amount of time to process the Arabic story compared with their Chinese story. Also, just recall and elaborations were not found when they processed the Arabic story, and it is reflected on also the distortion of the Arabic story, which was recurrent. In terms of the Arabic native speakers, they used less time to process the Arabic story than the Chinese one. Higher frequency was found also in elaboration and just recalling when reading the Arabic story than the Chinese one. Also, distortion was found in Chinese narrative text more frequently, and it was more frequent than the Arabic narrative text. The second research questions, how do Arabic, Chinese, and English native speakers view their reading of different cultural based narrative texts? Based on the participants' responses in the semi-structured interview, there are four main themes generated from their responses reflected their experience in this research. The first one is enhancing reading interpretation through cultural relevant text, which means that the familiar or the cultural related text can enhance the idea of reading comprehension and reading interpretation whenever they use English as a medium of interpretation. The second theme is distorted interpretation of unfamiliar cultural texts, which is normal because they don't have enough schema or cultural schema about the unfamiliar text, which affected the level of distortion, which is increasing whenever they encounter any unfamiliar cultural text. The third theme is related to the idea of stimulation of cultural-based narrative texts, which means that whenever they faced a lot of difficulties when they read unfamiliar cultural text, it enhanced their motivation to understand more about these stories related to a particular culture. The final theme is reciprocal interweaving between cultural schema and linguistic competence. It means that the language itself doesn't help the readers to understand the cultural-based narrative text, because they need also something called, or they need to build up their cultural schema too. This is one of the interesting points related to our study. It is an example of one of the Chinese native speaker who respond to the questions related to our study, and it is related to the Chinese stories by using the Arabic language. We found it to be it is interesting to share such of this sample because the Chinese participant found the Arabic language more easy and appropriate to express about his understanding regarding the Chinese story that he read. Finally, the recommendations. The first one is that understanding the role of cultural schema is necessary for teachers, education and curriculum development. So there is a need to focus on cultural schema, how they can enhance it and how they can integrate it within the curriculum and even assessment. Also, longitudinal multi-phase mixed method design should be considered to determine different realities about cultural schema construction and the construction along with the construction of linguistic competence and how they are complementary with each other. The third point is considering the English language and how it affects the reader's interpretation of cultural topics is essential. So there is a need for investigation on using English for cultural purposes as an extension to the current study and even to the language used for specific purposes. Thank you.